everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something that I call Take the Doughnut, which for me is another way of saying carpe diem. It's about going after what you want in life. And something that I wanted to do this year was to rewatch the show Halt and Catch Fire, but this time talk about it with other humans. And we're up leveling that now because I'm talking with people who actually worked on the show, about the show. So this is going to be another one of these amazing interviews we're getting a chance to, deep dive into here. But before I introduce my guest, I just wanted to make this quick caveat. If you're brand new to the show, the episode recaps are safe and spoiler-free for you up until the episode that you're watching the podcast for. These interviews could be spoiler filled. We could talk about any detail from the show from any season. And I just want you to know that up front before we dive in. But having said all that, stick around because what a great guest we have today. I just want to introduce Jeff Freilich, who did a lot of things on the show. He was a producer for 40 episodes, also directed 3 episodes, episode 203, The Way In, 303, Flipping the Switch, and 403, Miscellaneous. So welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
First of all,
I'm very happy to talk about this show.
Oh, I'm so glad. First of all, a lot of questions that I can ask you, so many that come to my mind, but I did want to open with, how did you start working on Halt and Catch Fire, especially if you're on it for 40 seasons, you're a producer, you're obviously there before they start filming. How and when did you get connected with this show?
I knew somebody who was a production executive at AMC who sent me a script. I had kind of backed out of television series for a while. I had been doing movies for pay cable, for Showtime, for HBO. I then went off and helped a new writer named Matt Nix mount a show called Burn Notice. We did the first 3 seasons of it. But television series are a lot of work, and in these days, you don't really get to produce them in your hometown anymore. I live in Santa Monica, so I don't get to really work in Los Angeles very often. So for me to agree to uproot and go somewhere for a long period of time would take something very special. And Dan Hank, who was an executive, who was a vice president over at AMC, sent me a script, said, you might be interested in this. It was by 2 brand new writers. I thought it was an amazing piece of writing. I had not experienced a piece of television writing that was that invested in humanity, in people, in characters. I hadn't read male writers write women as well as they did, which I mentioned to them when I talked to them. It was an area that I was particularly fond of because I was one of the last holdouts against technology as a writer. I spent most of my career writing, and most of that time writing longhand, and occasionally on a Hunt and Peck Smith and Corona. But I resisted computers forever. And here was a show that kind of took me back to that cradle. But one of the bigger draws, aside from the fact that I was very attracted to the idea of working with 2 writers who had never been in the business before, and wanting to very much protect the writer. Having been a writer, having worked with a lot of producers who came to me with the most outlandish, stupid suggestions for how to save money, and clearly not adhering to the story, the tone, or anything else that I was looking for. I decided I wanted to be the person that I never had for the Chris's. But a big draw was the fact that it was Mark Johnson and Melissa Bernstein, because my favorite show, maybe ever, was Breaking Bad, and it was just concluding, for me at least. I got on board late, and I watched it all off a hard drive that my son gave me, and I wanted to meet them. Mark is a legendary film producer, and he won an Oscar for a Barry Levinson film, and worked with all kinds of wonderful people. Melissa, I didn't really know much about. I saw her credit as an executive producer, but I went to lunch with them, and they really wanted to make sure that my agenda was not to please the studio, but to serve the show. A lot of producers, in the capacity that I was going to join as producer, which was basically the person who is responsible for the physical production, how you spend that money, where that money is allocated. A lot of people do that job in an effort to prove how valuable they are to the studio by saving their money. I had those producers when I was a writer and created shows, and always wondered why producers would come to me and say, we can't shoot this, you know, and not have any suggestions on how to make it better or make it possible, or give me options to make my own changes. And so I saw this as an opportunity to not only help the Chris's learn how to write for the budget that we had and still get creatively exactly what they wanted, but I also wanted to be just as much a part of Mark Johnson and Melissa Bernstein's holding the flame for the writers, and protecting them and preserving what I thought was a really wonderful script and concept for a show. Although I must tell you that the pilot didn't really give you an idea of what the show was going to be like down the road. And I don't know that anybody knew what it was at that point. They knew what the jumping off point was, but can you imagine how many different directions that show could have been taken? And there were an awful lot of people who perceived it at first as, oh, it's Tech's answer to Mad Men. You know, Joe McMillan is basically, the John Hamm character, Don Draper. And you've got an environment, an office environment, and all of the rest of that. And the writers that were brought onto the show, and the Chris's, and the creative guidance of Melissa and Mark, really helped steer the show in a slightly different and very unique direction, I thought. So I had this meeting where I was extremely well scrutinized, particularly by Melissa, who I think vets people to a degree that exceeds the NSA or the CIA or the Secret Service. I mean, she really digs into people's past, and there's a great reason for it. She, and I totally agree with her, and we worked not at cross purposes, but for the same goal, was really intent on bringing together a group of people who were congenial, who would work together collaboratively, whose egos allowed for better ideas from other places. You know, we work in a very ego-driven business where it's very important that it's your idea that gets recognized because you want credit for those things. And we were really looking for people who didn't bring that attitude, but brought the kind of creative range that people who would deserve that kind of attitude would bring, but not step on other people's toes or climb over people's backs to get there. So, it took a little while to earn the trust, Melissa's trust particularly. Now I look back at the time that I spent with Mark and Melissa, and I spent most of it with Melissa, as the most remarkable period that I think I've spent in the 50 years I've been in this business. It was also one of the last pilots that AMC did. For people who don't quite get the difference, some people just think the pilot is the first episode. Well, when we made the pilot of Halt and Catch Fire, there was no second episode. There was nothing planned. There was nothing written. We shot it in the fall of one year, and we didn't know whether or not we were going to go ahead with it. We shot it in the summer, and we didn't know whether we were going to go ahead and make any more episodes. AMC had to watch the pilot and decide whether or not they thought there was a series there. That practice has pretty much gone away. Halt and Catch Fire was one of the last, not the last, but one of the last pilots made for AMC. After that, they just started to order 6 episodes, 8 episodes, 10 episodes of something that they believed in, that instead of just getting one script, they would put a writer's room together and generate 5, 6, 7 scripts and maybe an overview of the rest of the series, and then order the entire series. In the case of Halt and Catch Fire, we had to make a great pilot for them and convince them that there was a series there. And on top of it all, because they thought that it was not going to be that popular a show, that wasn't going to bring in the numbers that a Breaking Bad brought in, or particularly shows like The Walking Dead brought in for that network, they then gave. So that was the biggest issue that we had to kind of deal with, which is, can we deliver the show that the Chris's wanted? A period show takes place in the 80s, which is not a cheap period. It's not quite like the Revolutionary War, but those costumes are available. You can't go to used clothing stores and buy 80s clothing. It's difficult because it's popular, so there's not much on the rack. So, and the same thing goes for props and technology. But Juan Campanella was brought in. That was in part because of Mark Johnson's familiarity with him, because Mark used to, I think Juan mentioned this in his interview, Mark oversaw the part of the Motion Picture Academy that concentrated on foreign films. Is that committee. Juan had won an Oscar for The Secret in Their Eyes. He's a wonderful director. He went to NYU. He lived in New York a lot of the time. His knowledge of television was second to none, and his knowledge of 70s movies, also 70s and 80s movies, which is what helped, was to figure out how on a rather limited number we could make the show that was written without sacrificing too much of what was there. And the Chris's, particularly Chris Cantwell, who came from Texas, insisted on shooting it in Texas. That's where it belonged, because they were new at it. They didn't really understand at the time the ability to take a different location and convert it to what you wanted it to be.
Let's talk about that a bit, because you, when I first asked you to do the interview, I had to say, like, a lot of people have been talking about you in their interviews, either during recording or after, when we stopped recording. And I've been hearing a lot of stories about you, but all their stories revolve around like different tasks, like completely different tasks that you were doing. So you started to introduce a lot of those different things in what you've said already. But I know one of the things that you were responsible to do was to find a facility in Atlanta to house the series. So tell us a little bit about that process.
Mark, Melissa, the Chris's, and I, and a couple of people from AMC, when we suggested going to Atlanta to make the show, the Chris's were very skeptical. Predictably, it doesn't look at all like Dallas. It doesn't look at all like 1983 or 82. We had a wonderful location manager, Ryan Schetzel was his name, local to Atlanta, but originally not from Atlanta. And we toured all around Atlanta, and after a while, the Chris's, particularly Chris Cantwell, who's the most skeptical and the one who was originally from Dallas, had the vision, because they're incredibly creative guys, that it was possible to convert some of what we saw into what they saw. But was most convincing was the fact that it was the only place in the country that we could really afford to shoot it. One of the reasons why was because Georgia had the most at the time, and still I believe does, the most generous incentive toward the film community. It's 30%. So if I'm working for $1, AMC only pays 70 cents and gets back 30, of the dollar. And that goes across the board for everybody who works on the show, and all the material and all the locations and everything else. So it makes the show, it gives you more for your money, which is what we were looking for. We talked about using a minimal amount of CGI to get rid of some of the things that didn't quite look like they could be Dallas. We found locations that would work. But anyway, that was step one, getting everybody to agree that we would go to Atlanta to shoot. Question was, where would we shoot it? Because stage space was extremely limited. And the other thing that was very important was, when we shot the pilot, we shot, as you could see, that Cardiff office was gigantic, huge, actual practical office building that we were lucky enough to find vacant, but was very expensive and would have been totally impractical to have shot an entire season of television in. We knew at the time that we shot it, if the series got picked up, we would need to build that. And that is a challenging thing to do because it's a huge, unrestricted space. And most sound stages you walk onto have pillars everywhere. And that would have restricted the space and would have made it very difficult to duplicate what we shot practically. So Halt and Catch Fire, the pilot was done. And I had another pilot conveniently to make for AMC with Jonathan Demme. It was the last thing that he directed. And we shot that in Atlanta also, oddly enough, for Texas. I mean, I don't know how that happened. And one afternoon, I wanted to go hit golf balls at a driving range up in the northeast corner of Atlanta. And when I got off the highway there, I looked across and there was this huge blue-gray structure that had a Freilich sign outside of it. And I called our line producer, Steph Aceta, and she was the production manager and line producer, and she's really responsible for getting equipment and making deals and getting leases signed and all the rest of that. And she's very much the kind of the stabilizing force on the show. And I called and I told her about it, and she researched it, and we found out that it was an abandoned dog treat factory. And we got a tour of the place, and it was remarkable because it was two gigantic rooms between 25 and 30,000 square feet, which is a large soundstage on a Hollywood movie lot. Generally, they're 15 to 20,000, with no pillars on one of them, which was incredible. The other one had several pillars, but that didn't prevent us from being able to build like the Gordon House or some other small set like that. It had a lot of office space. And so we made a deal with the guys who owned it that they would pay to completely redo the building to our specs. And I had done this myself before when I had developed a show called Freddy's Nightmares. That was Nightmare on Elm Street as a television series. And we found a warehouse out in the valley in Los Angeles and did the same thing. And then I had a show that I made called Dark Justice, where we found another one out in the valley. And it's how do you make something for less money? You don't go to a major studio and you don't rent a soundstage. So we didn't go to Pinewood in Atlanta instead, or Screen Gems or whatever. We found this dog food factory. But by the time we were done with it and made this wonderful deal with the people who owned it, it was perfect for our show. And actually, when we finished Halt and Catch Fire, we put bronze plaques up that were paid for and thought of by the cast. And one says the Cantwell stage and the other says the Rogers stage. And those plaques are up there. But we made a studio for our needs. And it was kind of like the Little Rascals going to the barn and putting on a show. It was our place. And, we could do whatever we wanted with it. We shot outside of it. I mean, if you remember the sequence in the first season where it's Whack-A-Datsun, where they're all outside, there's a big fair and Joe McMillan is beating the crap out of this Datsun.
Yeah.
That was the soundstage. That was right outside.
Is that what that event was called? Whack-A-Datsun?
Yeah, it was Whack-A-Datsun.
I didn't know what to call it in my recap.
It came from the backlash of importing Japanese cars in the 70s and 80s. Oh. And they actually had events like that every once in a while.
Oh,
and the hostility toward these imported vehicles that are taking the place of American-made, cars. And that was before the Japanese started to build cars in the United States. So
you do a deep dive on an episode and then all this other stuff comes up. It's amazing. There's always more. It's so funny. It was a dog treat factory. Something that's obviously coming up a lot in how you're talking about this is a big part of your responsibility was keeping things producible in terms of budget and schedule. And I imagine you were having to look at many different areas through those lenses. But I'm curious if there was anything that got written into scripts or was creatively something the writers wanted to do or the creators wanted to do that you knew would be hard to accomplish, but believed in it so strongly that you really pushed to get it across the line. Were there any big wins for you like that?
Oh yeah, I mean that was the fun of the job, you know. Um, I was very lucky. I came to the job with a lot of experience. I've been in the business forever. I had worked as a writer most of my life, so I spoke that language. And my empathy and my loyalty is 100% toward the writers. I think that, writers are television. Actors come next, but it's very difficult for an actor to be truly engaging when they're reading expository, boring dialogue all the time. What Halt and Catch Fire gave me was the ability to wake up in the morning eager to find a way to say yes. To take what they wrote, and sometimes it was impossible, and we would have conversations about that. But I would get the script in its very first stages, and I would go through it and write a very long email to the Chris's outlining where I thought the difficulties might be, giving them a kind of old-fashioned Chinese menu of columns A, B, and C. And here are things that if you lose this, you might have these two things, or if you take these three things, you might need to get rid of this thing. But it was juggling all of this, but leaving the choices up to them, because ultimately it had to be true to their vision. And so good examples are AMC had, for no reason that I could understand. And by the way, shows like Mad Men and Breaking Bad were not really produced by AMC. Mad Men was produced by Lionsgate. Breaking Bad was produced by Sony, as was Better Call Saul. AMC really only was making, through its own studio, The Walking Dead, and then Halt and Catch Fire came along. They had tried a couple of other shows, but AMC was 100% producing and airing Halt and Catch Fire. So they were the people that I had to speak to. I didn't have a Sony to buffer me or to deficit finance some of the overages. So they had a hard and fast rules: $40,000 an episode for music, for example, which, when you are making a period show, means that you don't really get to buy any music, because $40,000 is less than one big song would cost. I mean, I used Absolute Beginners, a David Bowie song, on episode 301, I think it was, or rather 303, which was the episode that starts at Joe's house. It's a party. David Bowie's playing. That song cost probably 60, 70, $80,000. I don't remember what it was, but the point is that that number's hard and fast. When we did the budget, they wouldn't have approved it if I had raised that number. But they gave me so much freedom after that. They had confidence in all of us as producers. Certainly Mark and Melissa, they had delivered two of their best shows ever, their most successful shows. Very hard to mess with them if you're AMC. In my case, I gave them a promise. I said, I'm not going to come to you for more money, but don't tell me how to spend the money that you're giving me. Let me figure that out with the creative team on the show. Jonathan Liska, 2 seasons, and really helped teach the Chris's how to be showrunners before he left after 2 seasons. Also had a lot of experience in the John Wells camp. Was very, very good at moving money around if they really wanted something specifically. So I'll go back to what it was that were challenging. Music was extremely challenging. And what I would start the season off with was, every time we come in under budget on any show, let's take that money and spend it on one of two things, because there's only two things to spend it on at the end. Once you're cutting the show, it's either music or visual effects. If we eliminate visual effects, if we try to shoot things that we can use without having to, repaint everything, then we can move that money over to music. And there were some times where we could move a lot more money over to music. We couldn't change it in the budget, oddly enough, because AMC would have said, well, you can't do this. They ultimately backed off of that position because they realized that the show is responsibly produced. And at that point, they just let us do what we wanted to do. I think other people might have abused that. The other thing that was important was it was important that we have some of Dallas in the pilot, that it can't 100% be shot in Atlanta. It was important that when we moved the show to San Francisco for seasons 3 and 4, that we have some San Francisco. And that was a crazy weekend. That was all we spent in San Francisco shooting anything, but it made you feel like you were in San Francisco for the last 2 seasons of the show. And we never took any actors to Las Vegas, but Chris Cantwell and I went and shot 1 million plates in Las Vegas. So when he did that beautiful sequence with Joe and Cameron on the roof, and it looked like Las Vegas, that was shot there. And it's funny that when you aim in particular direction north in Las Vegas, it still looks like the 80s. It really hasn't changed much. But those were challenges. And what we did in order to accomplish that was we calculated what it would cost. In the case of San Francisco, Lee Pace and I flew to San Francisco, where we met up with Kimberly Pierce and Reed Morano. And in the course of 2 days, and Chris Cantwell joined me there, we shot scenes from 4 or 5 different episodes. Reed Morano shot the last scene from her episode, which was the 4th episode of season 3, I believe. Kim Pierce shot one scene, people surfing in the background. I shot a bunch of sequences of downtown from San Francisco and other places that were salted into, I think it was Daisy Mayer's first episode of that season. I think she directed that one, if I'm not mistaken, unless it was Karen Kusama. I'm not sure. I think it was Daisy. But we figured once you created the illusion of being in an environment, it's stuck. I worked on a show in the 80s. I was the showrunner of a show called Falcon Crest, which took place in the Napa Valley. I ran that show for 56 episodes, and we needed it to look like the Napa Valley. So I kind of borrowed what our procedure from that show was for Halt and Catch Fire on a much smaller, cheaper scale. But on that show, we would shoot 6 days for every episode in Burbank and 1 day for every episode in the Napa Valley. And because we had 28 episodes in a year, we would do that 28 days right in the middle of the schedule. So we'd shoot 14 days on stage, 14 episodes on stage. We'd go to the Napa Valley for 28 days, shoot all of that stuff, come back and shoot the last 14 and fill in the blanks that we left. In this case, it was, well, how do we do this and not worry about where Lee Pace is for a few days because he's in so many of the scenes, and not take our key DP with us, our cinematographer, and put a crew together in San Francisco that can do this, who knows the show, who likes the show. And it was a lot of fun, and we pulled it off. And I remember it being very late. Reed Morano had been a cinematographer. She really hadn't done much in the way of directing episodes of television. Melissa had suggested her as a director because she had seen a feature that she did on a very low budget, and she had done a beautiful job. And I was apologizing to her because it was getting late in the day and she had almost no time left to shoot her scene. But as a cinematographer, she looked at the sky, she looked around and she said, the light's going to be much nicer by the time you give me the camera. And it was like, it's that kind of attitude that infused almost every episode of the 4 years that we were on. It was always somebody finding a way to turn something that could be difficult into a joy.
You've talked a bit about some of the other directors, but you directed 3 episodes of the show, 203, 303, 403. So, how did that evolve? Did you always know that you were going to direct episodes of this show? Or, obviously you didn't do any in season 1. So how did that evolve for you? And how was it different for you to direct as somebody who had that long-term role on the show versus some of those people who came in for one episode?
Well, at first I was hired, as I mentioned, to kind of oversee the physical production of it and to manage a small amount of money and try to turn it into a lot. That's a big enough job as it is. And every decision that had to do with how money was spent would be, fielded by me one way or the other with the help of the people I had around me. We all believed, and I'm sorry to digress for a second, but I've worked places and I've known people who've had shows or even movies. We're in the hiring process, and this works more in the writer's room on television shows than in other places. But there are a lot of people who are afraid to hire people who are better than them because they're afraid they're not going to look as good. So they'll hire people who yes them a lot, and tell them every idea that they have is a great one. We really believed on Halt and Catch Fire and hiring people that were better than all of us. So in putting together a writing team, John Lisco and the Chris's and Melissa Bernstein and Mark Johnson brought in some of the most wonderful writers in television, and managed to keep several of them through the course of the series, even though some of them came in to even just consult, like Jason Cahill, who was a wonderful writer, had a very experienced background, Lisa Albert, Zach Whedon, Angelina Burnett, a lot of really wonderful writers. In my case, I wanted to surround myself with people in production who, could give me better ideas than I had. And that was really my job. It was like, find great set deck people, find a great production designer. Wasn't my sole. The Chris's, Melissa, and I all interviewed all of these people. We came to a consensus. It was amazing how much we agreed on everything. But my job was never going to infringe too much on the creative process beyond suggesting potential alternatives to what was written. And I would write these long emails to the Chris's, who after a while started calling me Papa. And when I would say, what are you thinking when you're writing this? I'd get these emails back from them going, we're so sorry, Papa, to disappoint you. How about if we did this instead? It was great, but that was my creative role on the show. I had almost only directed, and I directed many things in my life, but almost everything was something that I had written. Very rarely did I direct anything that I didn't write. The first time that I ever did that was actually on Burn Notice. I directed a couple of episodes of that show, usually the mid-season finale. And it was, I never wrote on that show, so it was always somebody else's writing. But on Halt, I'd never planned to do it. I love it, but the problem is that when you direct, you need to take yourself out of the picture for almost 3 episodes, not just one, from my job, right? I would need to take myself out of my job for the most part for the episode preceding mine, which would be when I would prep and go on location scouts and have meetings with wardrobe and hair and set deck and stuff like that, and go through the casting process, which I didn't normally have to participate in. I participated in the deal making with the actors, but not so much the choosing of them. But when you're directing, you need to participate in that. And then I would need to fly back to LA and do some editing. We weren't as tech savvy as we are now talking on Zoom. We didn't have that. So we had enough trouble setting up video conferencing just to talk to the writers. It was a clunky system. I wish we had this, but one of the only benefits of the pandemic, I think, is what we're using right now. But I wound up directing the first episode totally by a kind of tragic chance. It wasn't a funny story at all. It was quite sad in retrospect, but we managed to have fun making it happen. It was episode 3 of the 2nd season. I was eagerly on my way to meet with Kimberly Pierce, who had just arrived and was in a van with Melissa Bernstein on their way to a location. I had a special interest in seeing Kim Pierce because I hadn't seen her since a couple of days before 9/11 in New York in her apartment, looking at the World Trade Towers, having coffee together, knowing that that's where she probably was sitting that morning. And I tried calling her after that. We had a movie that we were developing together, and this was many years before she came to Halt and Catch Fire, and she never responded to my calls. And I was kind of afraid that it was such a terrifying and cathartic event for her that something had happened. But I was delighted when Melissa found her, came to me and said, "What would you think of Kimberly Pierce?" And I said, "Please," at first. So I was on my way out to see her, and I got a call from the set. It was day 2, shooting episode 3. Danny Liner was shooting it, who had done, I think, Dude, Where's My Car? And he, before calling action, walked out of his trailer and collapsed. And I got a call from the set, which was 40 minutes away, in front of the real Mutiny House, and across the street from what became the house where Boz gets his Mustang back, right? I was going to go down there that evening because I was going to shoot the entire sequence of Boz driving and singing Rock Island Line. The job that I did have on the show occasionally was I would pick up scenes that couldn't be shot by the directors who they were assigned to, either because schedule didn't allow it or because they were added after the fact, or they needed pickup shots and stuff like that. So I did all of that. But that was convenient to everybody because I'm there and I'm allowed to do that. So that was the only reason I was going to go down there and shoot Boz getting on the bus after he gives the car to his son at the wedding dinner. But Danny had collapsed. And so I said, I'd be right there. And I turned around and called Melissa. And she said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "Well, what if I shoot the day? I'll go down. I'll direct the day. So we don't." And it was a Friday. And I said, "And then we'll see what happens. Maybe everything will be fine. Maybe it's just something temporary." I got down there. Danny didn't look good. We had EMT people. He didn't want to go to the hospital. The short of it was that he sat with me and Jason Cahill, who had written the scene. I didn't know Jason very well at the time. I had met him in the writer's room before the season started, but I didn't really spend a lot of time with him. And I hadn't read the script in a while, and I never prepped the show. So I was shooting it completely off the hip. But the difference with me doing it versus another director that you pick off, a chart somewhere and say, "Here, start shooting," is that I was so emotionally invested in this series. We had already done 1 season. We were on our 13th episode altogether, that I felt a connection to whatever the scene was. It was like, just give me a scene. I know what it should be for Halt and Catch Fire. I knew the actors extremely well. We all spent time together. We go to the movies on the weekend together. We went to dinner every once in a while. It was a communication that was easy, non-combative, non-challenging. And the other thing was, given the circumstances, they couldn't have been more comforting and helpful. They wanted to make sure that I was going to succeed in this situation and that the show would succeed. More importantly, we didn't want to give them a dud, and I hadn't directed in several years. So for me, it was like, but I knew the crew really well, and I had hired most of this crew. And so I was in good hands. And the other thing was that I had Jason Cahill there, who turns out he's now one of my closest friends, but he was an amazing person to collaborate with. And I kept joking with him that we were the Wachowski siblings. It's like, let's do this together. If you don't like what I'm doing, you wrote it. Tell me what you like differently. So it was a very open kind of relationship. And Danny was there, but plainly not engaged. And over the weekend, Melissa and I realized that we really needed to put him on a plane and send him back to Los Angeles. She didn't tell me this until about 2 a.m. Sunday night. The night before, I would have had to get up at 6 o'clock to go direct Monday. We heard over the weekend that Danny was doing much better, so we just assumed, both of us, that he would be coming in on Monday, and my job for that one day was over. Unfortunately, he went back to Los Angeles. He had a serious condition. He sadly passed away, not that long afterwards. I don't remember whether it was a year or so. It it was a serious situation. And he was a lovely guy, and it was a tough way to fall into those shoes. But because of the support of the cast and that crew, and that incredible writer partner I had sitting next to me at the monitor, who was just doing nothing but encouraging everything that was going on, and some very difficult scenes. I think two of the most difficult scenes that I worked on in the 4 years that I was there, and certainly on the 3 episodes that I shot, were the scenes where Scoot comes and says that it's Nightmare on Nerd Street, and the scene where Mackenzie has her nervous breakdown, her panic attack. And
They're really powerful scenes.
but you know, but because I was shooting from the hip, made them better. And I think in part, and I've always kind of liked to do that. I don't like to tell actors where to stand and what to do. I kind of learned from people. I was certainly mentored by Peter Bogdanovich and Bob Rafelson and several John Borman and several directors that I've worked with in my life who had a very different approach to working with actors, which is, this is an actor's space. Let's see what an actor wants to do, and then find a good camera. Don't tell the actor where you're putting the camera and what you want them to do, because that inhibits them. Ultimately, it's them on screen, not you. And you'll get those cool shots every once in a while, but TV isn't about cool shots as much as it is about cool characters and engaging the audience in something that's visceral. From the perspective of the job that I did, when I would get a script in its early stages, and it was never intended for me to direct anything until that episode came up, and then it became a pattern. But as a reader, I always envision the show. I don't just read it as words. I see it somehow, and most of the time, I see a completely different show than the director directs. The person, I think, of all the directors that was the closest to what I would have seen was Juan's episodes, Juan Campanella's, and that's because, in part, Juan and I spent a lot of dinners and Negronis together, talking about the pilot and what style the show would be in and how the show would be shot. So his sensibility, which I loved, and our sharing 70s films like All the President's Men and Parallax View and The Conversation, things like that, which the style of the show in part is based on. When I would read a script that Juan was going to direct, I kind of knew what the show was going to look like. Sometimes he surprised me, like that incredible Wonder that he did. He came back and stuff like that. But still, he's an inventive guy, and you give him enough rope, and he'll not hang him. He won't hang himself. He'll make it really great, and that's what we would encourage people to do. But I had read episode 3, and not intending to direct it, and had seen certain scenes fairly vividly. And one of them was the panic attack scene. And the other, even more so, was the last scene in the show where Joe walks into the server room, and we do that continuous 360-degree rotation going around the room and around the room as things are turning on, because that's what that scene read like to me. And I think maybe the other scene, there were several in that show, but the Nightmare on Nerd Street, I really saw Donna as the kind of the referee in a boxing match between Scoot and Mackenzie. So I took the actors aside, Mackenzie and Mark O'Brien, who's a wonderful actor and incredibly smart. And we talked about that scene and how I felt that if I told Mackenzie what to do, it would hurt the scene, because nobody controls a panic attack. And so it had to be freeform and chaotic. Mark O'Brien, he knew a lot of that process and a lot of, ways to calm down somebody who's going through that experience because he'd experienced it. So I thought, okay, fine, this is like the height of method acting. Um, I'm not going to tell him what to do at all. I'm just going to put the camera where it belongs and follow them around. And I was going to do it with multiple lenses. And we had a great camera operator who I'd become friends with. And later I hired as a cinematographer, as a director of photography. And now he's very successful at it. But Glenn Brown was our camera operator and was great with both a Steadicam and a handheld camera. And that was done with a handheld camera. Steadicam would have made it too smooth. And what I wanted to do, and what he was so wonderful at, was putting the camera right in the face of the actor, either one. And I just kept changing lenses. So what it did was it gave you the sense of changing sizes subtly, because it wasn't huge lens size changes, but it was enough to pump up the chaos until Mark was able to settle Mackenzie down and sit her down and walk her through the game and have her take a breath. And Mackenzie Davis is such a wonderful and natural actor that it was just, she would come and she asked what I wanted, and I said, I just want you to do it. Just do it. And we did it multiple times, over and over and over and over, and in a way that helped her get even crazier, because she got so worked up, and I wasn't calling cut. It was like, okay, one more time, just keep doing it, just keep doing it, just keep doing it. And that's what came out of it. So she almost had a panic attack, and Mark really was very good at calming her down. So that's how that came to be. I think that had any director or I choreographed all of that, and planned it and storyboarded it, or whatever a director might do to really control that moment, it would have been a very different scene. It would have rung false. Not to compare me to him at all, but when Scorsese told De Niro to stand in front of the mirror and look at him in Taxi Driver, and De Niro went off on, "Are you talking to me? I'm the only one here." Scorsese didn't tell him to do any of that. He just said, do what you would do. Now, in part, I borrowed from that. Sometimes you just let actors do what they do, and when they're wonderful actors, sometimes they do something so unexpected and so wonderful that it makes you look good.
Something that strikes me when I watch that scene, and actors do a lot of things that are amazing to me, but Mackenzie Davis having to basically hyperventilate in that scene. And in order to do that, she's not shooting that scene once, she's shooting it many times. So she's actually putting herself into a physical state that you shouldn't be able to sustain. And then you have to find a way to shoot that and control, but not control the situation from a, directorial standpoint. So it's something that I thought about a lot when I was rewatching it this time, of how do you get control of a situation where her body was probably actually going out of control in order to simulate the panic attack. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about the sort of the framework that you created for it that let her play within it. But that it also had to be something that you could get the footage that you needed.
Yeah, and look, you have to thank Mark O'Brien for a lot of that also, because he was tasked with the responsibility of really calming her down. And a lot of actors would have, if I just kept saying, do it again, do it again, do it again, would have stopped and said, what am I doing wrong? What else would you like to see? Whatever. Mackenzie's so sharp and was so involved in it. And I think it also, goes back to the fact that I was dropped into this place, unprepared. And all the actors just got right on board and said, what do you want me to do? And rather than challenge, and some of the actors challenged other directors, but they didn't in this case. And I think in part it was because I allowed them more leeway than they might have had. But my instinct for what was a Halt and Catch Fire scene and what wasn't was better than some other directors, because I've been living with this show for so long. you know, in the scene with Scoot and Mackenzie outside the Mutiny House, where he comes drunk and says this is more like Nightmare on Nerd Street, it was a lineup situation. If you have the actors standing right next to each other, it's a different scene than when they're being separated by Carrie Bechet, you know, who doesn't know which way to look. Um, and you know, but Scoot basically turned to me and said, "Just let me do this, okay? Let me try something," and he did it. And I think that having the freedom with really great actors who are as invested as this cast was in this show, you're going to get something better than if you tell them what you want sometimes. Um, you know, these actors, this is the only show that I've ever worked on and the only cast that I've ever worked with that spent their weekends together studying the show. Three of them lived together a lot of the time. Scoot, Mackenzie, and Lee lived in the same beautiful big house on the outskirts of the park in Atlanta. Carrie lived nearby and would come. And every Sunday they'd have a potluck dinner and they would invite, I would go over, and sometimes the director of the moment would come and they'd go over the script a little bit, but they all knew it. Scoot knew his lines. He never had to look at his script when he walked on stage. Scoot would vacuum the house to a recording of all the other dialogue but his on his headphones, and he would talk back to it. So when he came to the set, he was that character. He knew the words weren't there anymore. It didn't matter anymore. He knew what the words were. What he was studying was the feeling, the reaction. Why is he saying that? Why is he standing there? Why is he doing what he's doing? But each of the actors had a bit of that in them. Um, Incredibly congenial group of people who worked together or fought with each other if that's what the occasion, you know. There was one day I remember where I think it was the third season, 303, where there's a big fight at Mutiny between Donna and Gordon, where Gordon walks out and Donna follows him, I think is what's happening. And Scoot was so angry that he left the building before he delivered his lines. And I had to convince him that he said, I wouldn't talk to her. I said, yeah, you have to talk to her. I would not talk to her. I would not stop and talk to her. And it was very difficult to convince Scoot to do something he wouldn't do. So then it was, well, how do I get? So I went to Carrie and I said, okay, you have to stop him so he talks to you. He's not going to want to stop. You're going to have to grab him and do it. And she got it. But they were angry at each other all day, even though they were friendly. They were angry at each other because Scoot came in angry at Donna. Gordon came in angry at Donna, and that's what he was going to be for the rest of the day. And yet, the minute you gave the actors the ability to play the scene more naturally, you got a better scene out of it. And that cast was brilliant at delivering those kind of performances.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Well, I wanted to ask one more question. I mean, you've been able to mention a number of different people from your time on the show. Are there any people, cast or crew, who you think were unsung heroes that you wanted to take a moment to acknowledge them here? I know it's a bit of an unfair question because there's so many people on the show and you had such an important role to each of them, but are there people that you think we really need to hear this name?
Yeah, it's funny. What unsung means to one person is different than another. I think that one of the things that Melissa and I and Steph Aceta, our production manager, tried to do with regularity on the show was to applaud people for their efforts and to encourage people to give us new ideas and you know, to try their best not to say no despite the restrictions and the resources that we had, because we were very good at trying to, you know, trying to find more for them. And the writers were the ones who were giving that ability to us because they would simplify some of the shows. Um, you know, take out an expensive location and give us another song. Take out you know, a day out rather than a day on stage, and give set deck more to do. But I would say that Lance Totten, who was our set decorator for all 4 years, which is very rare in television, um, did a brilliant show, a brilliant job rather, in repeatedly year after year, regardless of whether it took place in Atlanta or in Dallas in 1982 or San Francisco in 1992, would deliver period accurate, technologically accurate set decking, which means furniture, which means computers, which means, all kinds of other things. Uh, Going into a restaurant and changing out the light fixtures because they were the wrong period. Um, he loved doing that. He spent his life on eBay looking for things. It was incredible. I think that Chris Brown, who was our production designer for the first 2 years, was sensational. And then Ola Maslik, who did the last year. Um, Again, because on limited resources, it's a lot to ask somebody to do big period shows. Chris came as the former art director on Mad Men, being trained on a show that had a much bigger budget than we had, but and an executive producer who is extremely picky about accuracy. And he came in and he would say the wire on that wall is wrong for that period. We have to replace. He'd change everything in a room, but it'd be like, Chris, we can't do it because it takes days and days and days, which means a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of manpower. And he would find ways to accept, you know, don't shoot in this direction. If you don't shoot in this direction, it'll look like 1982. And so he remained true to the period, and yet, went overboard to try to give us exactly what was written, um, in a way where I think the audience kind of got sucked into that time period without it looking like it was period. I think Thomas Golovich mentioned something too that was interesting, which was that in supplying the show with music, it wasn't always on the nose for the period. When it came to wardrobe, props, set deck technology, it had to be. When it came to music, that that informs the feeling. It doesn't necessarily have to inform the time period or the story, the time of that story so much. So Thomas would bring things that would inform our feelings more sometimes, but not necessarily be period accurate. Whereas Chris Brown had to make it authentic to that time. Um, Kimberly Adams, I thought, did a wonderful job digging up period costumes for a period that became popular again, so it was even hard to find that kind of stuff sometimes that didn't look brand new. Uh, Steph Aceta, who was the line producer, I think, had come from lower budget independent movies, which is one of the reasons I hired her. I'd never worked with her before. She was recommended to me by somebody that I knew from Burn Notice. And she was wonderful at spending money in ways that would put aside enough for us to creatively have a bigger war chest. There are a lot of people who just blow the money on camera equipment or whatever it may be, but she was a very difficult person to negotiate with, but she's so pleasant and so nurturing that it's hard to say no to her. So I'd watch her bring people to, down 50% from what they asked just because she was so nice to them. It's like, how do you say no to stuff? Um, I think that I think that the guest actors on the show are all unsung heroes. I think that, working on a limited budget, we had 5 lead actors, and spent most of our money in casting on those 5 lead actors, although none of them made a ton of money on the show. They all were paid reasonably, but not like on a bigger television show where there's endless money. So that meant that we were left with much less money for guest stars. And then in the course of making deals for these guest stars, and that was my job, unfortunately, I would have to kind of sell the actors and their agents on the material. And you're not coming to do an episode of CSI where you're going to say it looks like he was shot in the leg. You're coming and you're talking to another actor and you're sharing human experiences and feelings, and you're playing a role that you would probably never get a chance to play anywhere else on television. It was such a unique show that way. What was it really about? I mean, you can't sit there and tell me the high concept that the show was. Ultimately evolved into a show about, you know, it was funny. We had T-shirts that the original ad for the show was "The Battle for Control Begins," and the cast made T-shirts at the end that said "The Battle for Control Ends," um, which we all have, and I still wear mine proudly.
Oh.
But it was all about interpersonal relationships, marriages, life, death, sexuality, a time period that was particularly difficult for so many people, particularly the middle class and people with less money, about a field that was originally populated more by women than with men until all of a sudden there was a profit to be made. And all of a sudden, women started to get kicked out of the tech business and men started to take it over, which was one of the reasons the Chris's and all of us supported this decision, made the women in the show perhaps the most important focal point. Um, you know, our actors did a tremendous amount of studying about that period. And Mackenzie was the one who came and said, do you know that there were more women coders at the beginning of computer coding than there were men? Because nobody thought anybody would care about any of this. Nobody thought about personal computers. Nobody thought about commercializing this technology in a way that it would be in everybody's household. And that's when the men took over. It's that kind of misogynistic business. And we kind of fought to avoid that. I mean, we didn't embrace that and make it all male. But when you look at the coders, but they were all male. But where I was leading with the actors was that you would be offering a role to somebody and they would have to come to Atlanta. And I wasn't offering them a lot of money. And the other thing was that I was asking them to book week after week after week after week and travel them back and forth constantly, because when we cast somebody in episode 1, we knew that we would use them 7 or 8 more times throughout the course of the season. And what if they got a role on something else? Catherine Newton was a great example. In season 4, I was directing the 3rd episode. It was the dinner party that Donna throws for her team, and her daughter shows up late, right? And she's telling the story about holding her as a baby and kissing her. Well, Catherine was booked to do Blockers, the movie that was being shot in Atlanta, which was the only good news, because they had her in first position, which is a legal term in casting for that movie took precedence over us. If I wanted her on Thursday, if Wednesday night they said, oh, we need her tomorrow, we couldn't have her the next day. Catherine Newton is a rare breed of person who somehow manages to juggle everything in her head at once and can switch immediately from one thing to another seamlessly. And she's also a great golfer, by the way.
She's very
But
prolific in it,
yeah,
like everything she does. I
she was
don't know how
amazing.
she's one person.
She was amazing, and she embraced Susanna Skaggs and supported her the whole time. And they acted like the same kind of sisters as our younger team did, who you already did a wonderful interview with. But I made a deal with Catherine Newton, which was way below what her going rate was going to be. But she hadn't become the Catherine Newton she is now. She hadn't starred in a couple of movies, and yet, it's like, but I need you for the dinner scene. I'll shoot around you. I won't show your chair. I'll do whatever. But can you come and give me 2 hours after you're finished on the set of Blockers? And she showed up like at the last minute, did costumes in the bedroom of the house that we were renting instead of a trailer, walked right onto the set, was great in the scene, but and did it for very little. So all of those people that we had as guest actors, and Susanna, who had to travel back and forth from, I think, North Carolina, all of the coders who reserved lots of time. Some of them were local to Atlanta, most of them were not. All of them had, or actually most of them since then, have had active careers. In a lot of ways, Halt and Catch Fire started them out. Susanna had never acted before, ever. Melissa Wan and I interviewed her and read her, and she was so raw and so wonderful and had never done anything but school plays.
And there
And,
weren't really
and
a lot of things like, there aren't a lot of TV shows that I can think of now where the younger sibling has a lot to do.
yeah, no, it's true. And
I
it's
mean, like she has a lot to do in this show.
well, that grew out of the fact that she was so talented
Yeah.
that the guys wrote for her. That once they saw her, they thought, let's see what she can handle. And I think that if you looked at the sequencing of her role starting in 301, through the rest of the series, you'll see that she gets more and more and more and more as time goes by. Was it 301 or 401? Now I'm lost for a second.
She was in the
Four,
fourth season.
fourth season, 401. Right. They moved to San Francisco beginning of the third season. 401 is where we meet her. And in 403, which is the show that I shot, it's where she gets hired by Joe. And there's that marvelous moment where Joe and Scoot are fighting over her. And and she's just all business. And she just sits there and says, okay, here's the deal. And it cracked us up. Lee couldn't stop laughing. It'd be like, okay, can we wait a second before we do another take? It was just so precious, so wonderful. And the sequence where she discovers the porn channel on the internet, which is
Can't wait to
also
get to
wonderful.
season 4 and rewatch. I just love
but
these scenes so much.
but all of these actors who gave themselves to this show and went out of their ways to schedule their time did it because they loved the show. And I think it was in part because we gave them a show to love. And this all goes back to the writing, again. I think that and I have to also hand it to AMC, who's a kind of an unsung hero, because the show never got great ratings. And yet they recognized the value of it. And I think that AMC at the time had been recognized as the basic cable channel that delivered really high quality, intelligent, literate programming. And they certainly proved that with Mad Men and with Breaking Bad and with Better Call Saul. Hell on Wheels was kind of a fun Western, but it was smart. Walking Dead was a smart take on that genre. But Halt and Catch Fire was a risky show. And the hope was that it would generate an audience, which it did when it got to Netflix, which is funny because Breaking Bad wasn't a big hit until it hit Netflix either, nor was, to some degree, Mad Men. AMC, unfortunately, doesn't have the pull that a lot of networks have. But AMC stuck with it. And they paid us another courtesy, which was invaluable to the writers, which paid off in the end, which is before the fourth season was picked up. They told Mark and Melissa and the Chris's that if they pick up the show, it would be the last season, which is like telling a novelist you only have 100 more pages. So you got to wrap this up. Like telling me, who never shuts up, that I only have 5 more minutes on the interview. It's like, it's good to know that you have an end point. And the Chris's embraced that, knowing that they got to write a last chapter. That show could have gone on for many years because there were a lot of stories they could have told, but instead they chose to tell an ending. And they wanted to pound home the emotional aspect of the show, even more than the first 3 seasons presented, because the show in a way didn't even find itself until season 2. And then it started to grow into season 3. And then by season 4, it was really, it had established what that show was. And so when they brought the writers in for season 4 and said, this is the last season, we need to write to an end, they wrote, in my opinion, at least, one of the greatest last episodes in television. And a lot of people will talk about the last episode of Breaking Bad or Mad Men or maybe The Sopranos, but I think the last episode of Halt and Catch Fire is incomparable.
I agree.
And I don't think it's just the last episode. It's like the last few episodes. You feel like you're being sucked into something.
There's a sort of from the moment we go back to Comdex in season 3 and we see those characters recur, the brothers, we see them come back. It feels like the show is starting to say, okay, like get ready. You're going to see this start to wind down. It's like we ramped up and we're ramping back down. And I could feel even from that episode, like, oh, we're heading somewhere. So I watched the whole series on a binge the first time I watched it. Didn't see any press about it. I didn't know what your uncertainty was between seasons. I just looked at it as 40 perfect episodes in a show that was always meant to be told 4 seasons, 10 episodes each. So it's so interesting to me that you had to find that continuity and that sort of overarching feeling amid uncertainty each season. Are we going to get another season? Okay, now we have to come to an end. It feels really uninterrupted for me.
We didn't know from season to season whether there would be another season. AMC was still in the kind of traditional television business, which was let's look at the ratings and see. When they looked at the ratings and they realized they weren't great, what offset the ratings were the terrific reviews. Because even from the beginning, the show was well reviewed, but the show got better reviewed as seasons went on. And I think that was because we all found the show after a while. I remember having lunch with John Lithgow before we started making the show. And neither of us knew what the show was. We read the pilot. The Chris's couldn't quite articulate where it was going. They're very instinctive. They're very internalized. They're incredibly brilliant. And you can't find two nicer guys. I mean, I'm still friends with them, but they're like, I mean, they were wonderful. But they had a lot of it in their own heads. And some of this was Chris Cantwell's father's story in a way. His dad was in that business. He came from Texas. It was informed by a lot of truths. But Jonathan, who was going to be the showrunner and help them learn how to do that job, wasn't sure where the show was going to go or what to do with the show. What kind of stories do you tell? When Juan Campanella and I met and started having dinner together, we're contemporaries. There was a camaraderie between the two of us, and plus we were the ones there all the time at the beginning. It was how do you create tension and pace and excitement in a show that basically takes place in an office? And that's why we talked about movies like All the President's Men, and you put the camera down low. And I think he mentioned to you the photography of Rodchenko, the Russian photographer, who would take a look at a landscape or a cityscape and find one perfectly vertical or horizontal line and tilt the camera to match that line perfectly, but it threw everything else out of proportion. And, if nothing else, Hitchcock taught us that if you make the camera create an image that's slightly off to the human eye, it makes the human person who owns that eye uncomfortable. And it creates a mood that wouldn't have been there if you just put the camera like on a network television show right in the middle, center punch somebody and have them say dialogue. The other thing that we talked about a lot, and I unfortunately had to do that in episode 3 of the second season, where Joe is working downstairs in the basement. We purposely loaded his desk with paper and stacks of things and all the rest, and put him very uncomfortably in the corner of the frame. Juan did that a lot in the pilot with Scoot. You can see that. But putting an actor, making a character look uncomfortable on screen creates a kind of false sense of, but it's very effective, of tension, even though there may not be any tension in it. There was no life and death story in Halt and Catch Fire except, Gordon and that wonderful character that we brought in San Francisco, that worked with Lee, whose name I'm forgetting, and you'll probably
I don't know how to pronounce it, but Manish Dayal or
Manish Dayal was the actor, but I'm trying to remember his
Ray.
Ryan, right? Who commits suicide. So it's like, I mean, but there's no life and death, so it's not like people are chasing anybody. There's no car chases. There's no, there's nothing that's traditional melodramatic or Deus Ex Machina moments in this series. It's all real, but that's what made it so brilliant. That
Mhm.
the feelings emanated from the characters and the words and some brilliant performances,
Yeah.
some truly astounding moments in acting, um, on everybody's part. It's like you can find a best scene for everybody and say, who else would have done that way, you know? Um, and it obviously got better as the seasons went by because the characters, the actors knew the characters better.
Yeah.
Uh, and when you'd bring a director on, and occasionally we did it, but that's why we stuck with the same directors for the most part. Several directors directed multiple episodes. Juan, Karen, Daisy Mayer, I did, but a few others that we really would have loved to come back. Mira Manon was one who I thought did a great job, and every time we tried to get her, we couldn't get her. She did that amazing episode, which was a phone call. How do you make an entertaining hour out of a phone call?
That's one of
And
my favorite. That might be my favorite episode of the
it's
show.
amazing. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
It was
And
very before sunrise-esque, but adapted in a
yes,
way that works for TV because that movie doesn't work in a TV show where you have to cut to other characters doing other scenes. And so I came away feeling like it was the best part of that, but its own thing also. And there were some really cool choices.
it was brilliant, and I must admit that my job involved sitting on the set a lot with the director. Um, Very rarely telling a director what to do. I would never do that, but I was there to say, we're never going to make the day this way. We're going to have to do, we're going to have to sacrifice this or that, or what are your plans for that scene? You're going to only shoot one shot or whatever. But in Mira's case, she, I never really quite got what she was doing while she was shooting it, but she had a very strong sense of purpose, and her attitude was so relaxed and calm and confident, and the actors went with it. She was a wonderful actors director. I mean, you couldn't get those performances if you didn't nurture those performances as a director. But when I saw it cut together, it was like watching a jigsaw puzzle that you poured on the ground and went, I can't do that. And then when you saw it, it was like, wow, that was there, and it was extraordinary. Um, and a risky piece of writing, I thought, especially for a second episode of the season, because that's not when you want to make the audience feel listless. And instead, I think it sucked them into that relationship.
It either really
Yeah.
works or it really doesn't work for you. For it really worked for me, and I haven't heard
Yeah.
anybody say it didn't work for them. But I can imagine somebody who's not familiar with the show, who isn't really invested with those characters, it would be a sell to make them want to sit with that conversation for so long. But it was so
A
beautiful.
network television would never have let you shoot that episode. Never on any network, Fox, NBC, ABC, CBS, nobody would let you shoot that episode. They would say, well, you want to do a conversation, one act, okay, but not. Um, so I thought it was gutsy on the writers' parts. I thought it was gutsy on the director. The actors loved it. They embraced it. They thought it was really cool. Um, but I think that was very representative of what the entire series was like. I think there were some very calculated experiments. Um, you're talking about Thomas about music and stuff like that. A lot of the music came from um, Thomas's group would send us before an episode got shot a playlist, a potential playlist from that episode. They'd read the scripts and come up with thoughts, and they'd send a bunch of songs. They didn't always get used, but sometimes they did. And he's so brilliant, and he had such a great team that it was hard to say no. And they're very, very good at finding things that were cost effective and stuff. But every once in a while, we wanted bigger songs, and sometimes some of us got greedy. I was one of them. I mean, I think I had Paul Simon and David Bowie, and "Burning Down the House" was the end of that episode, right?
Yes.
the Talking
My
Heads.
goodness.
But Tom Wilson and I put those songs in. I think I put a different song in, and then Rogers and Cantwell changed it to the Simon and Garfunkel or the Paul Simon song. But they were not the ones that necessarily were submitted by Thomas Golubic. We put Burning Down the House at the end. I really, really wanted it. And Rogers and Cantwell gave it to me as a gift because I don't know that it was exactly what they wanted, but they saw why it worked well in that scene. But it was expensive. So then going into it, it was like the same with a lot of other episodes where directors wanted bigger songs. You asked about the Sinatra song, or Rock Island Line or the Billy Joel song. Those all exceeded that $40,000 budget that I told you was the benchmark for it. But it was like, okay, let's talk about this in advance. What are you gonna want? And if you're gonna want $200,000 worth of music, let's talk about where that other $160,000 is gonna come from. And let's find an itemized list of things that maybe you can do without that give us that money. And then on top of it all, be efficient in how you direct. Music was a wonderful kind of carrot to dangle in front of a director. Do you really need to go 35 takes on that, or can you do it in 5 and save a couple of hours? And those couple of hours might buy you a song. That was the trade-off. It was never, we never tried to dictate anything, but directors jumped right on board, and particularly the ones that I mentioned. Blue Man Group, that was risky and expensive, but knowing Juan Campanella was shooting it, who doesn't know what a long day is. I mean, he's very quick, very decisive, very instinctive, and very wonderful, really terrific director. But Karin is the same way, and Daisy Mayer is the same way. Um, they all knew where they could get their little extra stuff from, and they did it by being efficient, and they did it by having a rapport with the cast that allowed them to be, you know, to be fast and good. And there's an old expression in television, which is, do you want it fast or do you want it good? And we were lucky we had people who could do both, which was necessary for the show. So,
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation and hearing all the things that this brought up for you. Is there anything that you're working on now that you can share? Anything that we should know about what you're up to, or anything you've worked on since Halt and Catch Fire you want to point us to?
right after Halt and Catch Fire, I had a wonderful experience on a show called Lodge 49, which was watched by even fewer people, with an almost equally wonderful cast, with a showrunner in Peter Acco, who has since become one of my best friends. I just have been very, very lucky. As I mentioned before, I've been doing this for a long time. I've kind of gotten to the point where, especially now, I really only want to work with people who I like on shows that I would want to watch, and not just take things as a job. I did a year of one show. It was a 10-episode show with Jason Segel called Dispatches from Elsewhere, also with AMC. I was with AMC up until recently for about 11 years. The strike changed, the two strikes, the Writers Guild strike and the actors strike last year, changed a lot. AMC, where I was also head of production for a while, was becoming ambitious. We were going to make 20 shows. And between the strike and the fact that everybody stopped and realized that we can't all be Netflix, everybody became overly ambitious. Everybody cut back on the amount of production. So for me, I went from Halt, regrettably, and I bounced back and forth. The first 2 years of Halt, I bounced back and forth to Grace and Frankie. I was producing that show, which was a joy. After that, I made this deal at AMC where I stayed there because going back and forth between the two shows was difficult. But that was another show that I loved. I mean, how can you not love going to work with those people? Jane and Martin and Sam Waterston and Lily Tomlin, for God's sakes. It's like, and Marta Kaufman, just tremendous writer, creator of Friends. So I was very lucky. And the luck actually started once again with Halt and Catch Fire. But since then, I did the first season of Mayfair Witches in New Orleans. I didn't do the second season. And I'm looking for something to do with, and it's all come around, with Jason Cahill, who worked on *Halt and Catch Fire* for all those years, and who I really got to know that sad day that Danny Liner collapsed, and I had to go sit next to Jason. He's an amazing writer. I read his stuff just for pleasure. He sends me all of his scripts. He just writes so well. I love the way words go together in his scripts. And the other is Peter Ocko, who is the showrunner on Lodge 49. And both of them have projects. And if their projects go, I definitely would want to work with them. But
Wow.
I'm getting old. I don't want to wake up in the morning and go, oh God, I have to go to work again. I want to wake up in the morning like I did every day on *Halt and Catch Fire* and say, I can't wait to get to work. I really loved going to work on that show. And I think everybody did, including the cast. And I think that that's part of the reason that you have this podcast, because what you saw in the show came from the ingredients, to a large degree. And I'm incredibly impressed with your knowledge and your insight into it. I mean, I've listened to several of your podcasts at this point. And predictably, you see a lot of things that maybe none of us saw at the time because it goes by. It's like riding on a fast train. You see a tree, you stopped and looked at the tree and can describe it to me. I almost don't remember what season was which. I had to look up my shows to remember which was which and what got shot when. But the gestalt, the totality of it all was unforgettable. And Melissa and I said this at the end. It was the saddest last day of shooting I have ever experienced. Mackenzie Davis, after Karin said cut, and that was the end of the series, Mackenzie turned to me and came over to me and just collapsed on me, crying, sobbing, because those years, meant so much to everybody. But Melissa, who had a lot of experience at that point, Melissa Bernstein, we were talking about it. It was like we somehow caught lightning in a bottle. Everything about this was terrific, which is how we were able to make it as good as it was. Because with the resources we had and where we were shooting it, the weather that we encountered, we had ice storms the first season. We had to paint a golf course green because it was white with snow. We had to melt the snow and then paint yellow grass green on that scene with Scoot playing golf with his in-laws. That was done a couple of days after an ice storm. You would never have known it. If you freeze a frame, if you look in the way back, you'll see a little strip of white under the bushes at the back of the fairway on one of the holes. And that was the snow that the effects guys couldn't melt with hair dryers, which is what they were doing it with. It was incredible. But we had so many uphill battles on that show, on that series. And I didn't mention all of them when you asked me about what were the things that were obstacles, but I think that, serving what was on the page with the resources we had was the biggest obstacle, but it became a joy after a while. It became a puzzle. But we agreed, it was magic. And I don't know that we could recreate it. But people gravitated toward the show because they loved it. They loved what they read. And I know a lot of the people, I've worked with a lot of those people since on other shows. They all look back on it and go, boy, we couldn't wait to read a script. When those new scripts came out, we couldn't wait to find out what happened, and they were involved in it. And it made them get up in the morning and want to do a great job instead of just, I have dinner at 9, let me see if we get out on time, or I can't wait to be with my kids on the weekend or something. Nobody really asked those things. Everybody just put in everything they possibly could. So anyway, not to beat a dead horse, but
this is just amazing. Thank you so much for all the time that you gave to this and just taking a trip down memory lane in as many different angles as you could think of. I mean, you had so many different roles in your time on the show that, we're learning a lot of new information from everything you chose to share. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thanks for doing this. Thanks for keeping this alive. Um, you know, I have every reason to believe that the Chris's are both going to bring us something else amazing in the future. Chris Rogers is actually involved in something that Cahill and I were talking about. It's the three of us. I know Cantwell has got something new, and he also has this whole world of comics and stuff that he's been involved in. But they're two amazing people, and I feel very, very lucky to have known them at the beginning of their careers and to have been even a small part in helping them get ahead. And I met some amazing directors. And the last thing I also wanted to mention was that, and I have a daughter in this business, and I understand how difficult sometimes it can be for women in all businesses, but the entertainment business has been traditionally very misogynistic, even with the growth of women executives and women directors and stuff. But Melissa Bernstein's tie to women in film and the networking that she did early on as a very powerful figure in this business. Um, she, she's the one who really brought us all of these incredible women directors. Um, I can't say all of them, and I don't know everything that happened in the back, but I do know that she came up with some odd people, and I was skeptical. Like, she hasn't really done anything. Are you sure? And she said, if you're with them, they'll be okay. She gave me a lot of credit and confidence, but I think underneath it all, it was a little manipulative to say yes. And the fact is that she's too good at what she does to send me somebody who wasn't really good. And we gave starts to a lot of people, Reed being one. I think Mira Manan was somebody who was starting out early. People were transitioning from independent films, which included like Daisy, even though she had done a lot of television. Karin Kusama a little bit less, but she's now like impossible to get. Larissa Kondracki. I mean, the list of wonderful female directors was long, but never would have happened without Melissa bringing them. And I think that opened the eyes of and doors to all the other women on the crew, because we tried to hire as egalitarian a crew as possible and as diverse a crew as possible. And I think it was very, very important also in supporting our female leads. So we hired the best people, but we tried very hard to make sure that it wasn't skewed one way or the other. And I think it meant a lot. And it was to me a unique experience. And I've done a lot of television shows, as I said, I'd never seen that before. And I walked away from that show with, I'm hoping, some of Melissa's sensibility and try to carry that on, plus her ability to vet people. I'm a lot more skeptical. I used to believe anything anybody ever told me. Now I don't, and that's thanks to her. But anyway, I don't mean to go on
No,
forever,
this was just so wonderful. Thank you so much for everything that you shared, for all of the people that you shouted out, for all the different details you brought up. And to everybody who's watching, go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire. Okay.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.